Hi guys, for the very last exam, the reproduction physiology, I made earlier a YouTube video for you for the male reproduction. So let's wrap also the female reproduction system so you can have a good opportunity to review the material before the exam on Thursday. We agreed in the lecture that the female reproduction system, our reproductive system, is fairly more complicated than the male counterpart. And the reason for that, we agreed that the female bears the burden of not only delivering the gametes and performing the act of sex, but also to sustain pregnancy for 8 or 9 months, and then labor, and after labor then there will be the nursing part, lactation. So obviously the hormonal regulation of the female reproductive system is far more complicated than the male part, which only involves sex and deposition of gametes. So let's just appreciate first the primary sex organ here, which is the ovary. Just like in the testis, in the male we had the testis, and so the functions will have also dual function here: hormonal function and the production of gametes. The production of the gametes, which are the oocytes in our case, and in a process we will call oogenesis, which is the equivalent of the spermatogenesis in the male, although we also agreed in the lecture that there are significant differences, and I will address those differences as we move forward in this lecture. Now the hormones we are secreting from the ovaries are mainly estrogen, and in our case here it's estradiol. That is the primary estrogen secreted in premenopausal women. After menopause it's a different story, but estradiol, which is referred to sometimes as E2, is the main estrogen that's being secreted, and we will see how it's secreted, and it cycles. It's not constantly secreted like testosterone. In the male it was constantly secreted. Has nothing to do with diurnal variation, but it has something to do with the cycle, the stage at which the female is. And it's not even throughout life, because we know that the cycles don't exist in very early prepubertal life, and they don't exist either after menopause. So only during the reproduction period we'll have significant amount of estradiol, and after that it is reduced significantly, and that's why some women after menopause they would use hormonal replacement therapy in order to correct the problems that are attributed to the lack of estrogen, and we are going to address those as well. Okay, so estrogen is needed for the ovum maturation. It is needed for the second sex characteristics, development of breast, development the maintenance of the moisture in the vaginal secretion. It is not associated with the libido in the female. That is attributed to DHEA. As you remember, it is associated with breast development, even later on lactation, although the part that is associated with lactation, it's a different estrogen which is not secreted by the ovaries. It's an estrogen that will be secreted by the placenta, which is estriol. So it's slightly different estrogen that has nothing to do with the ovarian estrogen. Progesterone, on the other hand, it is important for the uterine functions. It's important to make the uterus ready for gestation. That's where the name comes from, progesterone. That's the steroid that is needed for the gestation, progesterone. And it's needed throughout. It's also known that progesterone deficiency can lead to spontaneous miscarriages. So it is a very, very important hormone. And the progesterone, again, that maintains pregnancy in the first trimester, that trimester meaning 3 months, is coming from the ovaries. But later on, it will be coming from the placenta itself. And so we'll see that together, that the placenta will kind of take over if pregnancy takes place, and will be supplying estrogen, although it's a different kind of estrogen. Again, we agreed it's estriol, which is referred to as E3, which is the weakest kind of estrogen, but it has significant value during pregnancy. In addition, the placenta will give you progesterone, which will take over the function of the ovaries, primarily your corpus luteum, because that's the place that will be secreting progesterone, as we will see together. Okay. So I'm going to skip through this because that's a summary of everything we will be talking about together. In addition to the ovaries, we have the reproductive tract. That is the pathway through which the gametes will go through. You remember the reproductive tract in the male included the epididymis, the vas deferens, the ejaculatory duct, the urethra, and in the female, the pathway through which the gamete and the egg is going to pass through will be your fallopian tubes, which are also the oviducts or the uterine tubes. Then the uterus and the vagina. The uterus, particularly the body of the uterus, is the one that does the cycling, the cervix, not really. The lower portion is the portion which is sticking into into the vagina, and it has a different epithelial lining, and we know that the change in that epithelial lining can predispose to cancer. That's one of the reasons a female, they go to pap smear every often, in order to make sure that there is no malignant transformation or there are abnormal cells in the cervix, because that can give a very good indication for precancerous lesion. But that's not our topic today. We are to talk about mainly the changes in the ovaries and changes in the uterus as part of the menstrual cycle or the follicular cycle. The vaginal moisture is maintained by vasodilation, and especially during sexual excitement, and that will be coming from the walls of the vagina, which is something that can be lost or at least reduced after menopause, because it is under the effect of estrogen. Okay. So I'm going to skip through the anatomy portion, and we'll just focus on the part that is related to our test, because I want you to we have only 1 day left for the exam, so let's review the material together here. So you can see here the uterus, and we talked how it's antiverted. Again, that's not really related to the physiology part. And connected to it, you will see the fallopian tubes or the uterine ducts or the oviducts. And at the very end, you will see those finger-like projections, and these are called the fimbriae. And they will be kind of wrapping around the ovaries, waiting for the ova to rupture, to ovulate from its Graafian follicle. And that will be picked by the fimbriae, and from the fimbriae will go to this wide area here, which we call the infundibulum. The narrow portion here, we call that the isthmus, and it's narrow for a reason. If you remember in the lecture, we said that the fertilized egg will not be able to pass back into the uterus except when progesterone is high, because the progesterone is going to prepare the uterus for implantation, but it's also going to dilate the tube and therefore making it easy for the fertilized egg and the morula or the blastocyst to move from the oviduct into the uterus. Okay. Alright, so the initial part that we will be discussing and we discussed in the class was the oogenesis, is the making of the gametes. Alright. If you remember, the making of the gametes in the male involved constant mitosis by the spermatogonial cells and constant replacing of the spermatocytes, the spermatids, and the spermatozoa. That happens all the time. It's not the case in the female, because we agreed in the female counterpart, the uterus needs to be ready. You can't just have a gamete being secreted when the uterus is not going to be ready for the implantation. So it's slightly different here situation. I'm not sure how it is in birds and animals that lay eggs. I believe the story is different because they are able to lay an egg every day. So ovulation is different in birds, but in human, where that egg has to be settled inside the uterus and for 9 months or so it has to be implanted, and so the uterus has to be ready for it, and we talked about that and we will review that together. So oogenesis starts in the intrauterine life, and that will be where the stem cells will be multiplying, and that's the only mitosis that will take place. The rest will be meiosis. And so those stem cells, or oogonia, they will multiply and fill the ovary, and then nothing. They will start the meiosis, but then they don't go through with it. It will just be arrested at the first meiotic division. They're not going to assort the chromosomes into different cells. It's just going to remain as duplicated diploid without removing the sister chromatids from each other, or removing even the chromosomes from each other. It's just going to stay this way. Okay, and so if we look at this map here, which we spent a good amount of time in the lecture talking about. So here's the stem cell. It's gonna divide by mitosis and stops at the first meiotic division. That's before birth. Initially we have about 3 million, 6 million, and then at birth we have approximately 1 million. Nothing will happen to those eggs. They will just stay the way they are until puberty, and not all of them will change either at puberty. Only 200 to 300 will start to have some changes, but they're not going to finish the first meiotic division unless that particular egg ovulates. If the egg ovulates, if that particular follicle rupture, then that egg will be the one that will have will complete the first meiotic division. And so the first meiotic division will give you, in our case here, which is different again than the sperms, in this case we will have unequal division of the cytoplasm. So therefore the secondary oocyte will have most of the cytoplasm, whereas the other part, the other product of meiosis, will have almost no cytoplasm whatsoever, and we call that first polar body. And please keep in mind that the first polar bodies don't really divide, and so ignore this part here. They do not divide. Now the secondary oocyte, these are duplicated haploid cells. Duplicated haploid cells. They're not true haploid because they still have double strands. They still have the sister chromatids attached to them, attached to each other, and they're not going to complete that second meiotic division except if fertilized. So they will require attachment with a sperm in order for that particular egg to undergo the second meiotic division. So you can see here it's significantly different than what we have seen in the male. In the male we have seen constant production of gametes and throughout life, and therefore a person who's 80 years old can still produce gametes, whereas in the female it's not the case. Born with approximately 1 million, at puberty it becomes about 200,000. Every month 200 to 300 are gonna be wasted in order to ovulate one, and that one that will ovulate will be the one that will complete the first meiotic division, and then the second meiotic division will be only completed after fertilization with a sperm. So keep that in mind. That is significantly different, and therefore menopause in the female is possible when all the eggs, not only the eggs, because the eggs don't make the hormones, it's the whole follicle that makes the hormones. So hormones like estrogen, progesterone will be secreted by the follicle, not the egg itself. The egg doesn't produce any hormones. Okay. Alright, so this is a summary of what we agreed, and we will see the remaining part here with the fertilization, implantation, and birth, what is going on and what happens in the follicles. Again, this is in male we have the diploid, and you can see that these are not duplicated chromosomes, so they will start mitosis and they will divide. They will give you type A, type B, we agreed into that, and then they will initiate meiosis, and then from that, when they complete the first meiotic division, then they will give you a secondary spermatocyte. When they complete the second meiotic division, they will give you your round spermatids. In the female, on the other hand, you have the diploid cells, and then they will start the meiosis, and then nothing. They are arrested in first meiotic division throughout life after, since birth onward, and then after puberty only one will exit that meiotic arrest, the one that will ovulate every month, and therefore you will have duplicated haploids, and those duplicated haploids will complete the second meiotic division only if fertilized. Sounds good? Okay. Alright, so we agreed that this is the process of oogenesis. There is a parallel process that needs to take place, which is the follicular genesis. Now the follicles, they are combinations initially of the oocyte and surrounded with a very thin layer of flat cells, which later will become cuboidal, and we call them granulosa cells at that point. In addition, the primary follicles will also grab some of the surrounding cells from the interstitial space, and we call them theca cells, which are very important in the production of estrogen, as we will see together. So it's a combination of three types of cells. Initially, the egg in the center, surrounded by what will become granulosa cells. In the granulosa cells, by the way, after the luteinization of the follicle by the luteinizing hormone, they will change the name into luteal cells because they are yellow, and they will be part of what is known as corpus luteum, the yellow body. And then we have, on the very outside, we have what is known as the theca cells, right? So let's have a look at the production of the follicles, or the process of follicular genesis. Again, this is not to be confused with the oogenesis, which is the maturation of the egg. Only thing we'll realize here is that the egg, although it's not undergoing any divisions, it's not undergoing any genetic changes. It is gonna get bigger and bigger because you are accumulating proteins, you're accumulating fatty acids and fat and glycogen in order to prepare for the divisions that will take place later on. So they get significantly bigger. In animals like frogs, you can see it with your naked eye. In human, it's fairly large. The oocyte, the mature oocyte or the ovulated egg here will be significantly big. It's not like a single cell that what you are used to see under the microscope. Anyways, there is a stage here before this which we call the primordial follicles, and the primordial follicles, the only difference between them and the primary follicles is the fact that the granulosa cells here are flatter cells, that's in the primordial follicles, and the theca cells which you see here haven't organized themselves. So if I take the theca cells away and if I flatten the granulosa cells, then this would be primordial follicle, right? And so this is a primary follicle, and the primary follicle here will start to grow and mature further under the effect of a hormone called follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. And the follicle stimulating hormone will affect the granulosa cells, which will cause the changes in the egg, but it's not that the egg has receptors for the FSH. The receptors for the FSH are on the granulosa cells. So those changes will include multiplication here of the granulosa cells, so you can see proliferation of the granulosa cells, also the appearance of a transparent layer here surrounding the egg, and we call that zona pellucida, if you remember. The theca cells will start to multiply and increase in number surrounding the follicle, or being part of the follicle and surrounding the granulosa cells. Okay, so the growth will continue still under the effect of the FSH. LH will kick in as well, and both LH and FSH, you will see they will increase significantly the estrogen. At some point the estrogen is so high, and we'll talk about that in the next couple of slides. Estrogen is so high that instead of suppressing the gonadotropin releasing hormone, it's actually going to stimulate the gonadotropin releasing hormone, and now you are producing a massive amount of LH. Also there is an increased amount of FSH, but the massive amount of the LH is really what is needed to rupture the follicle in what we call ovulation. From the name, LH is luteinizing hormone. That means this ruptured follicle will become luteinized. That means it will become yellow, and that is due to the deposition of more fat in it. Why? We talked in the lecture about that, because one of the changes that will happen in the cells is that they will acquire more receptors for HDL, high density lipoproteins, and they will trap cholesterol because they will be producing tons of estrogen and progesterone, so they require a lot of fat. If you remember, the cholesterol side chain cleavage is the very first step in making steroids in steroidogenesis. And so you have what is left of the follicle after two parts here will be left. The ovum itself that got ruptured, which will be surrounded still with some luteal cells and some and your zona pellucida. The zona pellucida will be very important later on for us, because that is the thing that the barrier the sperm has to overcome in order to fertilize the egg. We'll talk about that later on, but the remaining cells also here will secrete some hormones which are good to maintain the integrity and the life of the egg, but they're also good as chemoattractant. They secrete estrogen and progesterone, and that will attract the sperm their way, and we will see that when we get to the fertilization. So that is the ruptured part. The remaining part here, the shell part, like we said, will become yellow, hence the name luteinizing hormone. It's the hormone that makes it yellow, and will become known as the corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum, heavily vascularized, a lot of fat around it. If pregnancy does not occur, then the LH secretion is going to be interrupted by the massive amount of steroids that are being produced by the corpus luteum. And if you suppress those the LH hormone, then that will mean the corpus luteum is going to shrink and die, and then in that case we call it corpus albicans or corpora albicans. Sounds good? Okay. So here's just another way to look at it, and once again, so here is the primordial follicles. The primordial follicles will give you the primary will give you secondary. This is antral, and then when it becomes very, very distended, we don't have to know the difference between Graafian and antral, and when it becomes very, very distended, then that is the mature follicle or the Graafian follicle, which is just about to rupture. Sounds good? Over here they describe the theca cells as two layers, which are actually two different types, and it's described as theca interna and theca externa. The internal layer is the theca interna, and obviously the external layer is theca externa, but we don't have to know the difference between the two for our purpose. Sounds good? Okay. So, as I told you earlier, the granulosa cells which are surrounding the egg will start to deploy the theca cells. Remember, the theca cells were lingering around in the interstitium of or not the interstitium, but in the parenchyma of the ovaries, and they will be deployed into the follicle formation. Not all of them, just few of them will be deployed to the follicle formation. We call these guys theca cells, and they're very important because the granulosa cells do not have all the enzymes in the beginning. Later on they will acquire those enzymes, but in the beginning they don't have the enzymes to make estrogen. But we need estrogen for the development of the follicles. We need the estrogen for the uterine cycling. And so where do we get the estrogen if the granulosa cells is incapable? Remember, they are incapable of making those in the beginning. They will do it later on. They are only capable of doing this portion under the effect of follicle stimulating hormone. They will be able to convert testosterone to estrogen with an enzyme known as aromatase, but even the aromatase is initially not there. Aromatase has to be produced under the effect of follicle stimulating hormone. So where is the testosterone coming from? From the theca cells. So that's why you need this close association between the theca cells, which will be under the influence of the luteinizing hormone, which increases the production of testosterone and androstenedione. Androstenedione and testosterone will be taken up by the granulosa cells. And now the granulosa cells, all what they have to do is express an enzyme called aromatase, which will enable you to convert androstenedione and testosterone into estrogens. Get that? Everything else that you see here up will happen later on. That's why here it's interrupted, because that takes place later on after the luteinization of the granulosa cells with the effect of the spike in the LH, which we call the LH surge. Now, it's an interesting fact here also about the theca cells, because a tumor in the theca cells obviously will produce too much testosterone, too much androstenedione, and will give virilization. You remember the virilization we saw with the DHEA tumors, or a lack in the 21 hydroxylase, where you have tons of DHEA and therefore there is virilization in women, beard, chest hair, hirsutism, we call that hair distribution. The same thing, if the theca cells have a tumor, they will be producing way too much testosterone than needed, and therefore there will be also virilization effect. Okay. As I told you, there is at the mid-cycle. Mid-cycle, it depends on women, so generally the cycle is approximately 4 weeks. So we're talking about day 13, day 12, day 14, 12 to 14. Around that time, there will be a big LH surge, and we will see the reason for that LH surge in the next couple of slides. It is really caused by the high estrogen. And where is the estrogen coming from? It is coming from the follicle that has been developed. Remember, it's not only one follicle. You have many follicles that are being maturing. We agreed that 200 follicles will mature, but only one of them will ovulate, right? So keep that in mind, that it's not only one follicle that is maturing, but one follicle that will ovulate, and the rest will start dying. Okay, so we have very high levels of estrogen, and those high levels of estrogen, they will stimulate the hypothalamus at cells that will produce something called KISS peptide, and the KISS peptide will stimulate the GnRH. GnRH is gonadotropin releasing hormone. The increase in the luteinizing hormone will do a lot of things. Will increase the plasminogen activators and the protease and the collagenase, and therefore you are breaking the follicle apart, and that will release the egg. You want to break the follicle and cause rupture in the follicle. The LH surge will cause the egg indirectly, of course, because the egg doesn't have LH receptors, but it will have receptors for the estrogen. It will have receptors for the signals, the paracrine signals that are coming from the granulosa cells, which will become luteinized by the LH surge. It induces smooth muscle contraction of the fallopian tubes, and then within few hours, then you will start to see progesterone. And the progesterone, if you go back here, you will realize in order to produce progesterone by the granulosa cells, you need other set of hormones, other set of enzymes, and those enzymes will only be possible after the LH surge, that you will start to have the luteinization of the granulosa cells and the production of progesterone by the granulosa cells, which was not possible before. Okay, granulosa cells will start to multiply and will get yellow, and we agreed the yellow portion of it is because of accumulation of fat. Why the accumulation of fat? Because the luteinizing hormone will increase the receptors for the HDL, and now we are accumulating fat in the granulosa cells, which at that point we will call it luteal cells. Okay, good. And so after the rupture, then the remaining portion, we agreed, of the follicle, we call that the corpus luteum, will produce estrogen and progesterone under the effect of the luteinizing hormone. You need the luteinizing hormone to sustain the production of estrogen and progesterone from the corpus luteum. But with that, if the luteinizing hormone will go down, then the estrogen and progesterone also will go down, right? And it goes also backward, as the estrogen and progesterone are elevated by the corpus luteum secretion. They will suppress the luteinizing hormone. So you see, it's the same feedback we learned together in the thyroid. The thyroid gives you T3, T3 suppresses TSH, TSH is not going to stimulate the thyroid anymore, right? And the same thing with the ACTH. Pretty much the same thing here, except for the fact that this gland will die. It's not just going to shrink and then will come back again to life like the thyroid. No, it will die because we have constant supply of new corpus luteum that will kick in with every single cycle. Okay, so corpus luteum produces estrogen and progesterone under the influence of the luteinizing hormone. When the estrogen and progesterone go too high, they will suppress the luteinizing hormone, and therefore when you suppress the luteinizing hormone, they themselves will die, and there is effect of prostaglandin and inflammatory signals that will happen in the corpus luteum, which will cause the demise and the apoptosis of the corpus luteum to corpus albicans. But once they die, the corpus luteum dies, then there is no estrogen and progesterone, not high estrogen and progesterone, and therefore there will be inhibition of, or there will be relief of the inhibition of the GnRH. That means the GnRH is going to come up again to life, and that means your LH and the FSH are going to come back to life, and we will see that in the next slide. So I'm going to skip through a couple of slides here that we did not focus much in the lecture, but when it comes to hormonal interaction, this is the hormonal interaction which shows the pituitary hormones. It's not showing you the hypothalamic or the gonadotropins, and it's showing you the changes in the follicles, and we call that the folliculogenesis. It's showing you changes in the hormones of the ovary, and these are the estrogen and progesterone, or the estradiol and the progesterone, if we want to be specific, and the changes that will take place in the uterus. So let's take it one step at a time. And the first thing is your follicular development. I'm not going to start with the changes that take place in the FSH and the LH. Actually, I will leave that till last. So changes: primary follicle, secondary, antral, Graafian, and then the Graafian is rupturing, and or what we call ovulation, and that will leave to you the corpus luteum, and this part here, it will be fertilized if fertilization is possible. So corpus luteum around, if you look at the day here, the days around 14 is the day of ovulation. You see here 14, that's the day approximate, people are different, approximate date of ovulation. And then we have the corpus luteum is going to continue alive until you will see in a little bit that the luteinizing hormone is going to collapse, and the collapsing of the luteinizing hormone will cause the corpus luteum to die. Please keep in mind that it's the surge is really one of the main reasons that you have the ovulation happening. Without the LH surge, the surge in the luteinizing hormone, this ovulation is not going to happen. Okay, so this is the folliculogenesis, which we talked about. Initially, you are secreting estrogen and no progesterone. So the first half of the cycle, before ovulation, if you go here, before the ovulation and make a line, you will see that before the ovulation, before the LH surge, there were no progesterone, no, and then later on the progesterone will kick in. So that's why we call this phase here, before estrogen, we call it estrus cycle, or the estrus phase, whereas the second half here, the progesterone phase, because there will be progesterone, as you can see. Sounds good? So let's focus first on the estrogen that's coming from the follicles. And you're building in estrogen, and the estrogen will get into a really massive amount of estrogen. And the massive amount of estrogen that you see here is the reason for the surge that we see in the GnRH and the surge that we see in the LH and the FSH. The surge in the LH will cause the ovulation, as you can see here. And the ovulation, the rupture of the follicle, will cause the estrogen to drop significantly, just because of the disruption of the follicles, and also because one follicle, I forgot to say that in the lecture, you remember how we said that estrogen is coming from many follicles, but only one of them will ovulate and the others will die, and the others that die will result in the decline also of the estrogen, and significantly, because those estrogens were coming from the follicles that didn't make it into the ovulation. That's another reason for the estrogen to go down. But anyhow, with some time, that corpus luteum now is gaining the enzymes necessary to make estrogen and progesterone. It's producing tons of estrogen and progesterone, as you can see here in this graph that's coming from the corpus luteum. But wait a second, the elevated estrogen and the elevated progesterone will suppress the LH and the FSH level. And when you suppress the LH and the FSH level, that will cause apoptosis in the corpus luteum, from corpus luteum to corpus albicans, corpora albicans. And when it becomes corpora albicans, it's not giving you estrogen or progesterone. And when you don't have estrogen or progesterone, then the negative feedback is lifted, and then you will see elevation of the FSH and elevation of the LH. Elevation of the FSH, as you can see here, is the reason why the follicles will start to mature. Remember that? And you do need the LH at that stage, not necessarily on the granulosa cells, but you want it on the theca cells, because the theca cells will give you the androgen, which will be converted by the granulosa cells to estrogen. Keep in mind that you can see here, this is a very interesting fact, that with the elevation of estrogen, you have suppression of the FSH, but the LH remains not suppressed. And the reason for it, if you want to suppress the LH secretion, you want estrogen and progesterone, which actually happens here. If you see the effect of estrogen and progesterone combined, you will see that they suppress both LH and FSH. However, when you have only estrogen, you will be suppressing only the FSH, whereas the LH is going to be building up. And when you get to astronomical level of estrogen, very high levels of estrogen here, that will cause the LH surge because of its effect on other centers in the hypothalamus and the KISS peptide secreting cells, and that will increase the GnRH instead of suppressing it. Sounds good? Now, all of that were the hormonal changes, and these are the changes that happen in the uterus that are caused by the estrogen and progesterone. LH and FSH classically don't have receptors, although some papers now are showing expression of LH receptors and expression of FSH receptors in the uterus, but we don't necessarily know what they do there yet. But it's the estrogen and progesterone that are responsible for the cycling of the endometrium, At day one, which is going to be this one, day one is the first day of bleeding. First day of bleeding is day 0 or day 1, right? And so at that point, the FSH is going up. Why is it going up? Well, because why did the female bleed? Because there isn't estrogen and progesterone. Well, why isn't there estrogen and progesterone? Because the corpus luteum is dead. And when there is no corpus luteum, there is no negative feedback on the LH and the FSH. Therefore, you can see the LH and the FSH are climbing up, and the GnRH is climbing up, right? And so the follicular development will start already at day 1, right? And then the bleeding will continue. That's the menstrual flow. And then when it stops, the growth of the follicles has nothing to do with it. The follicles will continue to grow under the effect of FSH and LH. And so, but back to the endometrium here. We have loss of the endometrial lining because the estrogen and progesterone was very low. And when the estrogen start kicking in, you will start to see proliferation of the endometrial lining. When progesterone start kicking in, there will be other changes. The glands will be, the endometrial glands will be more visible. They will be full of glycogen. There will be the blood vessels. You see how spiral they are and how tortuous they are. And we call that portion here the secretory phase, whereas the early portion in the endometrial growth, we call that the proliferative phase. Whereas the proliferative phase is under the effect of estrogen only, The secretory phase is under the effect of estrogen and progesterone combined. Obviously, if someone is using contraceptive pills that are only estrogen, which are most of the contraceptive pills are only estrogen, then they're not going to the secretory phase, they're only doing the proliferative phase but not the secretory phase. So the bleeding is significantly less when someone is on the pills rather than the natural menstrual cycle. Okay, so this is just a confirmation of the same hormones, although we're adding here additional hormones, the 17-hydroxyprogesterone, but we don't have to worry about that. As I told you, the hormonal interaction will have 3 different phases. Early on in the cycle, you have only estrogen. Remember, estrogen is coming from the follicles, and the follicles are making estrogen through the collaboration between the granulosa cells and the theca cells. Theca cells are making the androgen. The androgen is converted by the aromatase into estrogen, and the aromatase is expressed under the effect of FSH. So now you have estrogen but no progesterone. So the estrogen that is being secreted by the effect of FSH, FSH is going to stimulate the granulosa, LH is going to stimulate the theca. In the end, you have moderate levels, not high, just moderate levels of estrogens. Those estrogens are going to go back and inhibit the FSH. They're not enough to inhibit the LH. And what makes it even more significant in their inhibition of FSH is that the fact they secrete also inhibin. You remember inhibin in the male was secreted by the Sertoli cells, and both of them together will inhibit the FSH, whereas the LH will continue. That's the first part of the cycle. At the mid-cycle, you remember you have a surge in the estrogen, very high level of estrogen, and those high levels of estrogens, which are coming from the mature follicles, will cause stimulation of the GnRH through activation of something called KISS peptides. The KISS peptides are going to stimulate the GnRH secreting cells, and the GnRH secreting cells are going to stimulate the anterior pituitary LH and FSH. So you have tons now of LH and FSH, even though you have some inhibition coming from the inhibin and even the estrogen, but this will be overshadowed by the excessive stimulation coming from the GnRH. Therefore, you have very high secretion, very high concentration of LH and FSH. For the LH, we're going to call that the LH surge. The LH surge is the reason for the ovulation to take place, and we did talk about that earlier. What are the importance of the LH surge? So induction of ovulation by changing the plasminogen activation, plasminogen activation process, by expressing proteases, by expressing collagenases, things that will break collagen, things that will break proteins, and therefore now the follicle is going to rupture, and that is under the effect of LH. Activin plays a role here, but we don't have to worry about the activin role. The LH also will exit, if you remember, will exit the egg from the first meiotic arrest, will allow the egg to undergo the second meiotic arrest, will cause changes in the granulosa cells, proliferation of the granulosa cells, but also luteinization will start to appear yellow, and it will start to have the enzymes necessary to make progesterone from scratch, and not only relying on the production from the theca cells. Okay. Late on in the cycle, after the ovulation, after you have corpus luteum. Corpus luteum is secreting to you estrogen and progesterone. Now the presence of estrogen and progesterone combined will cause suppression of your gonadotropin releasing hormone, and therefore inhibition of the LH and the FSH. And we all agreed that when you inhibit the LH and the FSH, then the corpus luteum is going to shrink and it will become a corpora albicans because you lose the stimulatory effect of the luteinizing hormone. Okay, so this is pretty much what we talked about earlier. Just added to it is the cervical mucus thinning, which it's a test you can make on the cervical mucus. You can take a swab of it and put it on a glass slide. It will make feather shape. We call that ferning, and you will see that this is high during the phase where estrogen is high, but once progesterone kicks in, the cervical mucus becomes very thick, and which is good to protect the growing embryo. If there is fertilization takes place at that point, you want to plug the cervix, and that will be maintained by the progesterone. Progesterone will plug the surface, will cause the cervical mucus to be very thick. There are changes in the body temperature that are associated with the high level of progesterone, and some women know or experience this kind of changes, and they would know when is the ovulation happening based on the change in the temperature. Progesterone, because it's also smooth muscle relaxant, it will cause bloating because the intestinal smooth muscles are not moving as fast as they should because of the effect of the progesterone. So progesterone is known to cause the bloating effect during the later half of the cycle. Okay. So we did talk about the ovarian cycle and now the uterine cycle, which we also talked about. We agreed that we have three portions of the cycle. We have the proliferative phase, which will be under the effect of estrogen, only estrogen, and then we have the secretory phase, which will be under the effect of estrogen and progesterone, and we have the menstrual phase, which will be the bleeding phase, which will be the lack of estrogen and progesterone and shedding of the endometrium. There is a lot of anticoagulants that will be produced, and that will destroy the fibrinogen and will not allow the fibrinogen to become fibrin. That's why the blood is not supposed to coagulate only in heavy menstruation. Then women can notice that the blood is clotting. Instead of passing as drops, it is passing as clumps of clotted blood, but that only happens with heavy periods. Okay. So we did talk about the menstrual phase, and there will be contraction of the myometrium, the smooth muscles in the uterus, and that will stop the bleeding, but will also cause the cramp and discomfort that happens during the menstrual phase. There will be a very unique process, we don't have to remember it for now, of initial constriction or contraction of the smooth muscles that will shut down the blood supply, and then that will cause necrosis of the endometrium, and then followed by vasodilation, or not vasodilation but dilation of those or relaxation rather of the smooth muscles, and then there will be blood flow coming in, and the blood flow that will come in will wash off all the endometrial lining, and therefore you want all the endometrium, the old endometrium, to fall off. You don't at once. You don't want the endometrium to start coming down one at a time or one layer at a time. You just want to remove it all at once and start all over, and that's what happens. And the smooth muscles of the uterus play very critical role in this phenomena, in the shedding of the endometrium. Details of it we don't necessarily have to entertain, but we need to understand the following, that the follicular phase where the estrogen will start growing. It will give you something called estrus phase, and the estrus phase is what is giving you the proliferative phase in the uterus later on. So everything is connected. The changes that are happening in the follicle will cause changes in the uterus because of the levels of the estrogen and progesterone. Progesterone will make, as we remember, in the secretory phase, will make the endometrium very thick along with the estrogen, but also the glands, the glycogen secreting glands will be very big, the blood vessels will be very tortuous. Also there will be changes in the mucus plug by the progesterone. The progesterone will cause the mucus plug to be thicker, and that is the base for progesterone only reproductive contraceptive pills, because they will cause the mucus plug to be thicker. They don't necessarily inhibit the hormones on their own, and we do give progesterone only pills in case if estrogen is contraindicated, like if the woman has history of breast cancer in the family, or has tendency for high blood pressure, so you would want not to give contraceptive pills that contain estrogen. Okay, estrogen itself, the high estrogen will cause the mucus plug to be very thin. We agreed to that. We called it ferning, if you remember. Whereas the progesterone later on in the cycle will cause the mucus plug to be very thick, and which is for a purpose. It's the thinning of the mucus plug will allow the sperms to come in. The thickening of the mucus plug will block everything to coming in, which is what you need in case if the fertilization already happened, because by the time you have high levels of progesterone, that would have been already 2 to 3 days after the ovulation, and so you don't really care about anything entering at that point because the ovulation has already taken place, and hoping fertilization already took place. So that is a good time to plug the uterus and not allowing anything to pass through the cervix. Okay. Menopause is cessation of these menstrual cycles. And why do we have cessation of the menstrual cycles at certain age? Because we run out of follicles. Remember, in the female, you don't have constant regeneration of those follicles or the oocytes. It's whatever you're born with as primordial follicles, those are it. Although now there is some research trying to prove that there are stem cells that can be resurrected and brought back to life, and therefore you may have some follicles then left, but that is still ongoing research. Menopause is associated with changes like hot flashes, because the absence of estrogen will cause disruption of the thermoregulation centers in the hypothalamus, and so there will be periods of vasodilation and vasoconstriction that causes the hot flashes that women do experience. Irritability is a known factor. Discomfort during sex because of dryness of the vagina. A lot of different problems associated with menopause. Osteoporosis is a serious problem. Women are generally less likely to have heart attacks during the reproductive age, and that is because of the protective effect of estrogen and progesterone on the heart. But with the menopause and the disappearance of estrogen and progesterone, then there is increased tendency for a heart attack, or at least it will be equal to the male counterpart at that point. And so there are changes that will take place because of the lack of estrogen after menopause, mainly the hot flashes, the osteoporosis, and discomfort during sex. Some women choose to take hormonal replacement therapy to make up for that deficit, but there are some studies showing hormonal replacement therapy may have some negative impact on the uterus and the breast, and so people prescribing it have to be careful. If the woman has history in the family of breast cancer or uterine cancer, generally it's not a good idea to give hormonal replacement therapy. There are other kind of hormonal replacement which do not stimulate the uterus and the breast. Those are, for example, the plant estrogen. Plants do have estrogens, like in the soy. There is something called cholesterol and daidzein, and those may have a good impact in alleviating some of the negative impacts of menopause, but not the same impact you expect from estradiol stimulating the breast tissue and the uterine tissue. The very last thing here to discuss is irregularities. So we agreed that with menopause there will be hot flashes, and I told you that there will be disturbances in the thermoregulation by the hypothalamus, increased risk of osteoporosis, increased risk of cardiovascular disease after menopause, because the protective effect of estrogen is gone at that point. There are some irregularities, and I told you in the lecture that we don't necessarily have to remember those for the exam, but amenorrhea, meaning no bleeding, no menstrual cycle. It can be primary, it can be secondary. Secondary if there is another disease, if the person is anemic, if the person is has some other conditions that caused the amenorrhea to happen. Hypermenorrhea is too much bleeding, too excessive bleeding. Oligomenorrhea is too infrequent bleeding. So that means instead of having the period every month, you're having the period every 2 months or every 3 months. That's oligomenorrhea. Polymenorrhea is too frequent, very frequent. So every 3 weeks, every 2 weeks, the menstrual cycle is. Dysmenorrhea is pain, excessive pain, cramps associated with menstrual cycle. It can be because of the opening of the cervix is too tight. It can be because the blood is not passing easily out. It can be because of endometriosis. It can be because of fibroid in the uterus. There are many reasons for dysmenorrhea, pain associated, excessive pain associated with the menstrual cycle. Endometriosis is the presence of endometrium outside the uterine cavity. So outside where it's supposed to be, even if it is in the uterus, but in the muscles. So you're not supposed to have endometrium inside the myometrium, right? The myometrium is the smooth muscle layer of the uterus. You're not supposed to have endometrium there. Not supposed to have endometrium in the fallopian tubes. You're not supposed to have endometrium in the peritoneal cavity or in the ovaries. And of course the presence of endometrium, which will start cycling. Endometriosis after menopause is not a problem, because the endometrium is not going to cycle, the endometrium is not going to bleed. But endometriosis during the reproductive age will cause the cycling of the endometrium and the bleeding of the endometrium. When the endometrium is lining the uterus, that's not a problem, because the blood is going to leave the body. But when the endometrium is inside the body, in the fallopian tube or in the ovaries or in the peritoneum, that's an issue, because it's going to cause internal bleeding and severe pain, of course. Okay, so that was the female reproduction, or the reproductive system, that I wanted to summarize with you. So now you have the male reproductive and you have the female reproductive. And I think we have a video online for the fertilization, the process of fertilization. I may make one more video for the labor and the hormones, the interaction between the fetal and the maternal hormones, and we'll post that to you as well. So, but at least now you have a good portion of this chapter available to you online for reviewing before the exam. I hope this will help, and I will see you in the final day in the exam. Have a great day.